Hello everyone, sorry we can't be in the studio again. We are going to try it over YouTube for another go and hopefully it will work. I had some nice comments from people in the corridor saying that it seemed to work last time, so fingers crossed that it does again. So in our last lesson together we discussed to what extent does society shape us, and we looked at some examples from the field of psychology and sociology which showed that we are really easy to manipulate and that we are heavily influenced by the behaviour of other people. And that is it's an interesting insight, and it's one that's perhaps slightly troubling because we like to think of ourselves as individuals, and our thoughts and preferences and ideas and ideals are our own and belong to us, but perhaps we rely on other people to shape who we are much more than perhaps we like to admit. And that brings me on to looking at the question for today. And that question is, what makes an action right or wrong? This has to be the most important question in ethics. It's fundamental to all of our lives. It's probably the most important thing that you will think about all day. How do we know whether what we're doing is a good action or a bad action? And the answer to that is so much more complicated than perhaps you might have realized. There are basically two fundamental positions on this. There is the absolutist moral position and the relativist moral position. And the point of this lesson is to try and work out exactly where you sit along the spectrum between these two positions. So a moral absolutist is someone who believes that there simply are moral laws in the world. There are things that are right and there are things that are wrong. So it might be the case that stealing is just always wrong, that lying is always wrong, that killing is always wrong. And from that list you might be able to deduce that religions quite often subscribe to moral absolutism. Probably the finest example of moral absolutism is the Ten Commandments, the tablets that Moses took down from Mount Sinai that told the Israelites exactly how to live their lives. There are no grey areas, it's just clear moral absolutes. Commandments: thou shalt not, do not, kill, murder, steal, lie, whatever. So the absolutist position is that there are just ethical truths that exist out there in the universe and they can be known. It's almost like a mathematical position. There just are facts about the world. A scientific position, there are moral facts that exist that we can discover, that we can work out, and it's not really up to us as to whether or not we should apply them. They just are applied in all places, at all times. It's not up to you. It doesn't matter how you feel. It doesn't really matter what the consequences are. You're just not allowed to do certain things. You're not allowed to lie. You're not allowed to steal. You're not allowed to kill. And these rules applied 500 years ago. They will apply in 500 years' time, and they apply now. They are the same in England as they are in Wales, as they are in Northern Ireland, as they are in China. They apply in all places at all times. So that view is called moral absolutism. There are a lot of problems with that view. There are also lots of good things about that view. That is moral absolutism, and that's one end of the spectrum. Right at the other side of the spectrum is moral relativism, and this says, come on, there are no such things as clear moral rules. There's no right and wrong. The world's infinitely more complicated than that. Every decision needs to be judged on its own merits. There's a context behind everything, and what's right in England might not be right in Wales, even in the same day, in the same year. It might be the case that something's okay in China that's not okay in Japan, and that's not okay in Korea, but is okay in India. Moral relativism says that there are no big moral rules that God gave to a prophet. They aren't carved out of stone and that they can be discovered by reading a holy book, nor can they be discovered logically and rationally by using the principles of mathematics or science. They just don't exist. All we've got are decisions that we have to make in the moment. And there are lots of things that can guide how we make those decisions. So do we try and prioritize safety? Is that the most important consideration? Is it maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, as we'll come to look at in a moment with utilitarianism? There are a variety of different ways of applying some sort of decision-making framework, but the crucial thing is that there are no absolute moral principles and there are no clear right and wrongs. The whole world is much, much, much more complicated than that. So those are your two fundamental positions, absolutist versus relativist. And I've got 3 case studies that I'm going to give you now that are going to help you work out where you sit on this spectrum. That's Dora the Explorer, and that is who you're going to be for the next couple of minutes. So you are going to imagine that you are Dora the Explorer and you are traveling around the world and you are meeting these different people and these different contexts, and we're going to start off by going back in time. And as Dora the Explorer, I want you to consider, is what's happening here right or wrong? Is it good or bad? Has a sin been committed, or is there no such thing as sin? So those are the questions that you are going to be asking yourself, and I'm going to give you the opportunity to have a discussion about this once I've pitched each case study. So the plan is we do a case study, I'll explain it, then I'll ask you to pause the video for 5 minutes while you discuss it as a class, and then we'll resume and carry on our journey. Okay. So the first one, this is an extract here from Herodotus's history. It's an example drawn from the classical world. And we've got Darius here, who's the king of ancient Persia, and he was very aware of the fact that in different parts of his empire, people seem to have different moral and ethical views. So he set up a meeting, a culture clash that has been debated throughout history ever since. And the debate is around a taboo subject, a kind of disturbing subject that we don't really like to talk about, and that is the disposal of dead bodies. So Darius has the Calations meet with the Greeks, and it turns out that the Calations eat their dead. So when their dead fathers' bodies are fit for disposal, they actually eat them. They consider this to be an act of respect. They believe it shows great deference. It is an example of how the ancestors are influencing the present, how they will live on. It's a really important ritual that they believe shows the right amount of respect to these loved and revered ancestors in their community. Obviously, they explain this to the Greeks, who are utterly repulsed. They think that this is absolutely immoral. Cannibalism is disgusting. They find it horrendous. And the Calations say, okay, well, how do you dispose of your ancestors' bodies? And they said, well, it's quite simple. We burn them. And the Calations, in turn, are absolutely outraged. They go, how could you do such a thing? We burn rubbish. That's what we burn. This is not an appropriate way of disposing of the bodies of our ancestors, of people that we regard very highly. And Darius's point here is that he couldn't convince either of them to adopt the practices of the other party. He says, how much would I have to pay you, Calations, to cremate your ancestors? And they said no amount of money would make us disgrace our ancestors in that way. He goes, okay, and turns to the Greeks, says, how much money would I have to pay you for you to adopt the Calation practice and consume the bodies of your dead fathers? And they say absolutely no amount of money would ever convince us to do such a thing. And Darius's point here is that how can they both be right? Maybe one of them is wrong, or maybe neither of them is right or wrong. And that's my question to you. What is your reaction to hearing about what the Calations do? We obviously follow the Greeks in our approach to lots of things, and this in particular. So what is your reaction? Do you think the Calations, in consuming the bodies of their ancestors, did something wrong? And usually we would consider cannibalism to be unethical. Or do you think they did nothing wrong? Are you sad Dora or are you happy Dora? Please have a discussion now for 5 minutes and pause the video here. Okay, so we started off with one taboo, cannibalism of corpses, and now we're moving on to another taboo, and this one's even darker still. So, because life is so hard to maintain in the areas where the Inuits live, because resources are so limited and food supplies so restricted, there have been certain behaviours that would be considered unethical in Western Europe that have become accepted in Inuit society, and one of those is infanticide. It is very common during difficult periods for the community, and certainly this historically was the case. It was very common for babies who were not wanted, or the community felt that they could not support, for them to be exposed. And that means a baby, when it's just been born, rather than be looked after, is instead allowed to die. This was also very common in the classical world, and it's something that is very shocking for us from Western perspective. The murder of anyone is considered one of the greatest crimes that you can commit, and is usually punished with one of the harshest sentences that our justice systems are capable of handing out. And that is definitely the case in regards to the murder of a child, which would be seen as the worst crime imaginable. And yet in Inuit society, there are occasions where this is not seen as a crime at all. In fact, it might be seen as responsible parenting or family planning. And so again, my question to you is, you're Dora the Explorer, and you turn up to a traditional Inuit society and you see this happening, you see this process unfold before your eyes. What is your reaction? Do you think the Inuits did something wrong, and you don't care about their particular situation, their cultural values, their consequences? They've killed someone, they've killed an innocent child, and therefore they have committed a terrible moral sin? Or have the Inuits done nothing wrong because their particular context and situation overrides your natural desire to try and save the life of an innocent? This is a really tricky question, because if you say they did something wrong, then you are judging their society, and you are suggesting that you are more ethical, more moral, you have access to a higher truth that perhaps they don't have access to. There's something perhaps condescending or patronizing about that. But if you say they've done nothing wrong, then you are saying that it's okay to kill innocent people in certain situations, and that even something like infanticide is justifiable if the situations are okay. And that might not be something that you want to say. So this is a really, really tricky question, this one. What's your reaction? Again, 5-minute discussion, please, and pause the video here. The final example I want to show you is number 3 here, the lifeboat case. So could you please play the video? It's only a couple of minutes long, which will explain this case, and then have the same discussion. What is your reaction? Are you sad, Dora, or are you happy, Dora? Did they do something wrong, or were they justified in their actions? Again, 5-minute discussion, please. Okay, so now you've had 3 discussions around 3 different ethical dilemmas. And what I'd like you to do is look back at the decisions that you've made and the conversations that you've had with the people around you, and consider, how did you decide if an action is moral or not? What criteria did you think were significant morally to make that decision of whether the Inuits did something wrong, whether the sailors did something wrong, or whether the Kalatians were wrong? How did you come to that decision, whether it was a moral action or not a moral action? So again, can you have another 5-minute discussion now, please? Just try and tease out exactly what things you considered to be morally significant. Excellent. What I'm going to do now is talk you through 2 very significant approaches to this debate. Now, the first one is a morally relativist position, and it's called utilitarianism. It has been hugely influential, and utilitarianism simply argues that what we have to do when we're faced with any moral decision is to do a cost-benefit analysis. So we add up the amount of pleasure the action is likely to cause, and we take away the amount of pain the action is likely to cause. And if we get a positive score, then the action is morally justifiable. If we get a negative score, then the action is not morally justifiable and we shouldn't do it. Could you please watch the next video, which is about 10 minutes long, explaining this theory in more detail? the video that I'm referring to is this one. The second approach is known by a variety of different names. We could call it a Kantian approach, and you'll have heard that mentioned in the previous video because Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher who was hugely significant in coming up with this approach. But it's probably better known as a human rights approach. And the human rights approach says actually there are certain rights that you always have, that you can't ever lose. And for anyone to violate those rights is immoral. It's just wrong. They can't do it. There's no situation, there's no possible context which would justify it. And if we apply that back to some of the case studies that we've looked at, for instance, the lifeboat case, we could say it doesn't matter how hungry the other people are on the lifeboat, you don't get to kill someone. The young boy had a right to life, and that was not forfeited, or that could not be explained away by the hunger of his fellow sailors. So to see this human rights approach contrast with the utilitarian approach, I'd like you to watch the next video, which is absolutely brilliant. So please watch this video, which contrasts the Kantian approach with the utilitarian approach and focuses on a particularly unsavory criminal case in Germany to see how the two approaches have strengths and also weaknesses. And that's all for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you had some good discussions. Thank you.